They're names that belong to a certain era of light, glamour, and music that the world will never quite see again. Dean Martin was one of those names. To millions of fans across the globe, he was the embodiment of effortless cool, a man who seemed to glide through life without a care, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a lazy grin across his face, and a voice so smooth it felt like warm velvet on a cold night. He sold out stadiums. He conquered Hollywood. He made television history. He was, by every visible measure, a man who had everything. But the camera always lies about something. Behind the tuxedos and the laughter, behind the sold-out Las Vegas showrooms and the glittering Rat Pack nights, Dean Martin was carrying a weight that fame could never lift. And the woman who understood that weight better than anyone was not a co-star or a celebrity friend. She was Jean Beager, the woman he married in 1949, the woman who raised his children, stood by his side through 2 decades of triumph and betrayal, and then, even after their divorce, quietly refused to abandon him. Their story is not one that Hollywood likes to tell. It does not end in applause. It ends in grief, silence, and 2 graves not far from each other in a Los Angeles cemetery. This is the story of how Dean Martin fell apart, and how the woman who loved him most could only watch. Dean Martin was born Dino Paul Crocetti on June 7, 1917, in Steubenville, Ohio, a gritty industrial town where steel mills lined the riverbanks and immigrant families scraped together whatever dignity and income they could find. His parents were Italian immigrants, and the household he grew up in was warm but modest, filled with the sound of Italian folk songs and the smell of his mother's cooking, but rarely the sound of financial security. English was not the first language of his home, and when young Dino entered school, he was immediately at a disadvantage. The language barrier made him a target. The bullying was relentless. He fell behind, felt out of place, and eventually dropped out before finishing high school. What followed were years that shaped the man more deeply than any stage ever could. He worked as a laborer in the steel mills. He pumped gas. He delivered milk. He ran bootleg liquor during the last years of Prohibition. He even boxed professionally under the name Kid Crochet, a scrappy welterweight who took far more punches than he landed. He was poor, restless, and searching for something he could not yet name. But somewhere in those years of hard living, a voice emerged, literally. He had a natural gift for singing, a warm baritone that could fill a room without effort. A bandleader named Ernie McKay heard him singing to casino gamblers one evening and offered him a job. Dean said yes, and the rest, as people say, became history. By the time he adopted the stage name Dean Martin, on the advice of bandleader Sammy Watkins, who told him the name sounded smoother and more American, he was already developing the charisma that would eventually make him one of the most famous entertainers in the world. He partnered with comedian Jerry Lewis in the late 1940s, and together they became a phenomenon. Comedy films, nightclub acts, and radio appearances that made the country fall in love with them both. But it was after that partnership dissolved in 1956 that Dean truly came into his own. He proved that he was not just a sidekick. He was a star. The Rat Pack years are the part of Dean Martin's story that most people know. The Las Vegas residencies at the Sands Hotel, the late nights with Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop, the films, the recordings, the television appearances, all of it flowing with an air of masculine elegance and American cool that no amount of careful marketing could have manufactured. It was real, or at least it felt that way. Dean's persona was of a man who never tried too hard, who never sweated, who drank and laughed and sang as though life was one long pleasant afternoon. But people close to him told a different story. His famous whiskey glass on stage was often filled with apple juice. The loosened tie and slurred delivery were part of a carefully constructed act, a performance of effortlessness so convincing that it fooled even his closest friends. Underneath it, Dean was quieter and more private than almost anyone in Hollywood realized. He did not stay for the after-parties. He did not sit up gambling with Sinatra until dawn. Most nights after the curtain fell, he went home, watched westerns on television, and went to sleep alone. He was not a man who easily let people in. His television show, which debuted on NBC in 1965, became one of the most watched programs in American history, drawing as many as 40 million viewers per week at its peak. He negotiated terms that nobody else in the industry would have dared to demand. No rehearsals. One shooting day per week. Full ownership of the episodes after their initial broadcast. The network agreed, and Dean delivered, week after week, walking onto that stage looking as though he had just wandered in from lunch and decided to entertain America on a whim. That was the genius of Dean Martin. He made mastery look accidental. But the more famous he became, the more distant from his own life he seemed to grow. Fame has a way of hollowing people out if there is nothing strong enough at the center to hold everything together. And for Dean, that center was always his family, and specifically, it was Jean. Jean Beager came into Dean's life in 1949, just days after his first marriage to Betty McDonald had ended in divorce. She was a model, graceful and grounded, with a warmth that balanced Dean's natural tendency toward emotional withdrawal. They married quickly, with Dean's comedy partner Jerry Lewis standing beside him as best man. And over the next 2.5 decades, Jean became the quiet foundation beneath everything Dean built. She raised their children together, Dean Paul, Richie, and Gina, and also took in Dean's 4 children from his first marriage. 7 children under one roof, and Jean held that household together while Dean toured, filmed, recorded, and performed. She was not naive about who her husband was. The rumors of affairs followed him throughout their marriage. The long absences, the world of show business, with its endless temptations, these were realities she lived with. She forgave him more times than anyone outside those walls could count. She stayed because she loved him, and because she believed in the man she knew when the cameras were off. But even love has its breaking point. By the early 1970s, the marriage had worn down to something neither of them could repair. They divorced in 1973 after 24 years together. Dean would later marry again briefly, to actress Kathryn Hahn in 1973, a union that lasted only 3 years and left him more isolated than before. Those who knew him well said that after Jean, he never found what he was looking for. The marriages that followed were, in many ways, searches for something he had already lost. What happened in 1987 did not just break Dean Martin. It ended him. His son Dean Paul Martin, known to family and friends as Dino, was 35 years old, handsome, full of life, and serving as a pilot in the California Air National Guard. On March 21, 1987, the F-4C Phantom jet he was piloting disappeared during a training mission over the San Bernardino Mountains. A snowstorm had rolled in. Search teams were dispatched. For 6 days, the nation and Dean Martin waited. When the wreckage was finally found on the frozen slopes of Mount San Gorgonio, there were no survivors. The loss was incomprehensible. Dean Paul had been the light of his father's life in a way that was different from anything else Dean had ever experienced. He had watched his son grow from a boy in a busy Hollywood household into a man of real talent and character. Losing him was not something Dean had any emotional vocabulary to process. He had built his entire public life around the idea that nothing could touch him, that he moved through the world untouched by its harder edges. But this shattered everything. Contemporaries and close friends described what happened next in almost identical terms. The laughter stopped. The performances became hollow and then ceased entirely. Dean had been scheduled to embark on a major reunion tour with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., a much-anticipated event that was meant to celebrate the legacy of the Rat Pack. He showed up for the early dates, but those who watched him on stage said he looked like a man going through motions he no longer believed in. He left the tour. He could not continue. Sinatra tried to reach him. So did others. But the person who actually got through, quietly and without fanfare, was Jean. There is something remarkable about what Jean did in the years following Dean's breakdown. She did not make it a public gesture. She did not give interviews or position herself as his caretaker in any formal sense. She simply remained nearby. She was a constant, understated presence at the Beverly Hills restaurant where Dean had taken to eating dinner alone most evenings. She would be there, a few tables away, close enough that he knew he was not entirely abandoned by the world. She did not crowd him. She did not demand conversation or emotional availability. She simply refused to disappear. It was a form of love that most people would struggle to sustain, particularly after the pain of a divorce and years of separation. But Jean had always understood Dean in a way that others did not. She knew that he was not a man who could be pulled back from grief. He had to be waited on, and she waited. By the early 1990s, Dean's physical health had begun to mirror his emotional decline. Decades of heavy smoking had taken a serious toll on his lungs. In 1993, doctors diagnosed him with acute emphysema and recommended surgery. He declined. Those who were present when he received the news said he showed very little reaction. He had told friends on more than one occasion that since losing Dean Paul, he was simply waiting. There was no drama in it. It was a quiet, settled resignation. He spent his final years in a Beverly Hills home, surrounded by old photographs and the flicker of a television set. The man who had once commanded the attention of 40 million viewers each week now lived in near total solitude. He watched old westerns, the genre he had always loved. He had occasional visits from his children, and Jean remained nearby, faithful to the very end. On Christmas morning, December 25, 1995, Dean Martin died at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 78 years old. The cause of death was acute respiratory failure, brought on by emphysema. His passing sent a wave of mourning through Hollywood and far beyond. Frank Sinatra, who had known him for nearly 50 years, described losing him as losing a piece of himself. 3 days after his death, Las Vegas did something it reserves for its most legendary figures. For 10 minutes, the lights along the entire strip were dimmed. The sands, the flamingo, the stardust, all went dark in tribute to the man who had made that city synonymous with glamour. He was buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles. His crypt carries the inscription drawn from the song that defined his public image. Everybody loves somebody sometime. Jean never remarried. She lived quietly and privately in the years that followed, close to her children and grandchildren, keeping the memory of her family intact without fanfare. In a cruel convergence of grief, her son Richie Martin, who had spent much of his adult life performing and honoring his father's musical legacy, died in August 2016. Just weeks later, in September 2016, Jean Beager Martin passed away at the age of 89 after a battle with cancer. She was laid to rest not far from Dean. What remains of Dean Martin and Jean Beager is not easily summarized by the glittering highlights that television specials tend to reach for. Their story is more complicated and more human than that. It is the story of a man who built an empire of cool on top of a foundation of deep personal loneliness, and a woman who loved him honestly enough to stay close even when she had every reason to walk away entirely. Dean Martin never stopped being haunted after 1987. The grief was too large, the loss too irreversible. He had made the world laugh for 50 years, and in the end, the world could not give him back the one thing that mattered most. Jean understood that. She did not try to fix it. She simply bore witness to it, with a quiet, enduring faithfulness that is perhaps the truest kind of love there is. 2 names, 2 graves, 1 story. Not the one Hollywood wanted to tell, but the one that was always true.